Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Alex Carter, and welcome to this webinar video on the human edge over AI. I'm here to talk a lot about the philosophy of AI, and I'm going to talk a little bit about creativity and the intersection between those two things. I'm a philosopher, I'm also a creativity theorist, and I'm based at the University of Cambridge Professional and Continuing Education. And what I do there is I oversee the philosophy courses, and what I'm particularly interested in is applied philosophy. So finding ways for philosophy to be effective and for it to be useful in our daily lives. And I couldn't think of a more effective sort of widening participation session than the main concern that we have at the moment. How do we maintain our human edge with the rise of AI? So I'm hoping that's why you've come to watch this video, why you've come to this webinar. So I'm going to jump straight in. Okay, welcome everyone. So to explain a little bit about where I'm coming from, just so you have a sense of who's speaking to you, I'm a philosopher, I'm a creativity theorist, and I'm very much interested in how those two things can inform the future of work. I am principally and primarily interested in philosophy. So what that means is I'm interested in questions like what is AI, what is creativity, what is the interaction between them, what is it that enables humans to be creative, and can that be reflected in AI? And if it can't, does that mean there's something special about it? Does that mean there's something unique about it? And I am really here to talk a little bit about the inimitable aspects of the aspects of human nature that can't be imitated by a system. And really, what drives me is the need to find a way of dealing with AI that doesn't diminish human beings, but elevates them. So rather than, this race to the middle, which we often see with different uses of AI, what that means is as AI gets better, we get worse. And then eventually we realize, hey, we're just as good as AI, but not because we've got better or AI's got better, but because we've essentially met in the middle. Instead, I'd like a system where there's a kind of rising tide that lifts all ships, where AI coming into our thinking actually elevates that thinking and makes us do better things. Because one thing I often hear people say when I ask them to extol the virtues of the use of AI, they'll say things like, it makes me faster, it makes me more productive. But I don't know if doing more is necessarily doing better. And the worry that we have is that if we produce just more things, but we don't make better things, then we're not necessarily enhancing what we're trying to do. We're not necessarily seeing improvements. And if you aim for good enough, as Sam Altman has expressed this idea that if AI is good enough, then it's good enough. And I vehemently disagree with this, not least because if you aim for adequate, the best you can achieve is adequate. And the worst you can achieve is less than adequate. And if that suddenly gets accepted because it's close enough, then the problem is you have this diminishing return. So what I'm eager to see is us not being complacent and really engaging with AI positively, trying to improve AI, but doing that through a kind of pessimistic view. If we view it as pessimistically as possible, can we find ways of utilizing AI that drives us forward to improve things? I hope that makes sense. I realize that we may have on the call people who are not philosophers. There will be a little bit of sort of deep dives into philosophy, but I will hopefully pull us out again so that we can actually stop and reflect and think about how that impacts AI and our lives. So the intention here is not to sort of inundate you with philosophical knowledge, but rather to get us thinking along philosophical lines and then trying to think about how we apply that. So one thing that I think is really important and worth thinking about is why human beings create and why we find it so valuable to do so. So this is not a particularly profound realization, but I had this realization that Bloom's hierarchy, Bloom's taxonomy, I should say, of skill sets that we use in education so consistently that it appears in every single course that we design. If we're designing a course, we design it according to Bloom's taxonomy. This is the pyramid on your left of your screen. And what we'll do, for instance, is if you get good, if you pass the course, it will be because you remembered certain facts and understood certain concepts. If you could also apply those concepts, then you might be coming up a grade or two. If you can analyze those concepts, you come up even higher. And if you can evaluate, you go even higher than that. But creativity is a really interesting pinnacle to reach because what my students will often ask me is, how do I get a first? And the problem I say to them is, well, if I told you how to create, you wouldn't be doing it. So I can't fill in that bit for you. So this is where you have to be developing those things for yourself as a student. And notice here on Maslow's hierarchy, we have a similar kind of structure. The basic needs, the sort of more factual or kind of fact-led needs, are towards the bottom. Where do I sleep? Where can I get food? What medical needs do I have, etc. But as they move up, they become things like being able to sort of utilize these for our safety, being able to utilize them for things that we value. Notice values start to appear in love and belonging and self-esteem. But then when you get again to the self-actualization level, you'll notice up here the word creativity. And creativity comes in because that's when we are often self-actualizing. We're often expressing the best of ourselves, or I feel most myself when I'm doing things that are creative. So what this tells me is that there is a link between learning and creating and development and growth, that all of this sort of meets with well-being, but also with learning and also with just how we want to live. These are the most general building blocks of how to live. In the sort of original ancient Greek notion of ethics, there is this idea that how to live is the most broad question we can ask. Right. So not just what's right and wrong in a given situation, but how should we live in general? And these speak to those sorts of things. And it's creativity that's driving a lot of this, that we're aiming towards. And what that means is that each of us is motivated by that which goes beyond simply applying or evaluating others' thinking. So rather than simply thinking about how other people think, we want to think for ourselves. We want to do our own thinking. And that emphasis on thinking is important for reasons I'm going to come to. That AI potentially threatens this very basic idea of thinking for oneself rather than simply evaluating the thoughts of someone else or something else, or just applying that thinking in a setting. So hybridizing AI and human thought is risky, because what it could do is diminish the very things that sort of are the building blocks of how we live a life that we find valuable and meaningful and so on. So this is core to our being, as it were, essential needs. And having just said that, the importance of thinking, look now at this quote where I use the word think 4 times to basically express there's a problem with thinking. And the line goes like this: AI does not think like us, it thinks like we think we think. Now, I know that sounds obtuse, and my intention is not to be obtuse, but rather to be actually quite as sort of uh, simple as possible. And I'm trying to express this as simply as possible. And I think this is as simple as I can express it. AI doesn't think like us for a number of different reasons, which I'll come to. One of them being it doesn't think; it is thinking, not it. It's thinking the noun, not thinking the verb. So that's one issue. It doesn't think at all. The other issue, though, is also we don't actually know how we think. So the problem we have is that how could we possibly have designed it to think like us, since we don't know how we think? And there are some basic errors we make in how we think about thinking. So if those errors are in how we think about thinking, they're going to appear in AI, which is thinking like we think we think. So again, this is, I know, seems obtuse, and I promise you won't get any more obtuse than this, but it is just to make the point that if we're thinking about thinking, we need to think correctly. And one of the issues that we have with AI is that we've designed it on assumptions that are faulty when it comes to how we think. And again, it's not necessarily my own view, although I appreciate others might disagree on my view of what thinking amounts to. But it is really important to be getting this correct. And I think that's a basic assumption we can carry forward. So interesting, having just mentioned thinking so much, I'm now going to tell you that I'm one of those unusual philosophers who says that I think we overthink things. So having just used this rather complicated statement about thinking, I'm now going to say that actually what we need to do is kind of move away from focusing on thought. So I want to show that it's our capacity to be more and significantly less than thoughtful that gives us our edge over AI. It's our ability to not think that is our superpower. And again, I realize that's an odd thing for a philosopher to say, philosophy typically has as its domain thinking, or thought is our domain, or truth might be considered our domain, really. But the idea of how to think is the art of philosophy. But I also have been mentioning thinking a lot. But I also just want to point out there's no contradiction to that. If we want to de-emphasize thought, one way we'll do that is think about how best to do it. And that's really what I'm doing with all this referencing to the process of thinking. So some creative acts seem to require us to not think. And it's those acts which I want to suggest are uniquely, inimitably human. Because AI, if it is purely thought, the noun, it's just a repository of our thinking, then what about the things that we do that don't involve thinking? So let's move away from that topic for a moment and think about what actions we perform that don't involve thinking. And immediately you might start to suspect that what I'm going to be talking about is what's on the screen, this idea of spontaneity, right? If I act without thinking, I'm acting spontaneously. And there's a certain sense of spontaneity that we will get into, but it's also about action, doing things. And the assumption for many years, or even centuries, possibly millennia, has been that in order to act, we have to think first. But the reason that's wrong is because if thinking itself is an action, then if for every action we have to think about it, then in order to act, we'd have to act, and then think to think, and then think to think to think, and then think to think to think to think. So again, it just leads to even more uses of that T word that I keep using. So instead, what we want to do is move away from that and focus more on what we do without prior thought. So there's a deliberate reason why Jackson Pollock's painting is shown on the screen here. And it's because there was, to some extent, a kind of methodology behind his painting, which we could debate whether or not this is accurate or not. One thing I will say is I was theorizing this. I was having my thoughts turned to Jackson Pollock. And then I watched a film called Ex Machina, which is all about AI. And in it, there is a scene where the designer of the AI asks one of his workers about Jackson Pollock and says, what would have happened if he'd thought about where to put the paint? And the employee responds, he wouldn't have made a mark. And of course, that means that has a double meaning, but the point is he wouldn't have been able to start. So there's something about this creative act, which I'm going to argue is not just unique to Pollock, it's actually something which is there within creative acts in general. And in fact, in creative writing, for instance, there's a philosopher called Maurice Blanchot who talks about the fact that in order to create, we have to step back, we have to decreate ourselves in order to allow something else to come to be. So Jackson Pollock, essentially his job in creating this painting was to get out of his own way, was to step out of the action. And for reasons that we'll come to, of course, he didn't succeed. So anyway, so let me go through a list of some of the things that I think AI can never do. And I've emphasized the word never because this is not simply a technical failing of AI. This is something that AI, no matter how long we worked at it, would not be able to do. And again, if you don't agree with me, fantastic, challenge me on this, question this. That's always what we want to see from our students and from people engaging with this topic, is for us to think for ourselves. But certainly I can see no obstacles to making these claims. So the first one is I don't think AI could ever act spontaneously. And I point to something called the spontaneity paradox to explain this. So the spontaneity paradox is if I say to you, be spontaneous, the one thing you can't do now is be spontaneous. So your inevitable reaction to that should be, but Alex, that applies to me and I'm human. I'm not an AI. And I was like, I agree. Yeah, the spontaneity paradox is a problem for human beings and for AI. But the difference between human beings and AI is you can ignore me. The AI can't ignore the command to be spontaneous. If that is its command, it must follow it. So the AI, if told to act spontaneously, now cannot but fail to achieve that. So it won't do it. I actually, interestingly, tried to do this. One of the very first things I tried to get an AI to do was to draw a picture representing spontaneity. And the funny thing was, it started drawing a hand drawing itself, but then it stopped halfway through and just it became an incomplete image. And I wonder if that's just because at that time it just couldn't finish. It just, no, this doesn't work. This doesn't make sense. So maybe today it would do something different. And what it would probably do is take the concept of spontaneity and sort of elevate it and then look at the word associations, look at how that works in a large language model. So anyway, so just to be clear as well, when I say AI, I am talking about all the different aspects of AI. So we're talking about generative AI, which is just about creating images and text and pictures. I'm talking about agentic AI, for instance, which is a sort of the next vogue in AI for creating sort of agents that act on our behalf. And then I'm talking about, general AI, or sort of AI as a kind of large language model processing system that can respond to our prompts. And what I'm suggesting is that in each of those situations, it would be stymied by the challenge to be spontaneous. So the second thing I want to suggest that AI can't do is suspend disbelief. And again, this requires a little bit of explaining. So I think we all have an understanding of what suspension of disbelief involves. What it means is when you read a fiction, when you read a piece of fiction, and there's a moment when the main character is under threat, you don't immediately reach for your phone and call the police. Why? Because you don't think it's real. It's not that you think it's not real, right? That would be disbelief. It's not that you think it's not real. It's that you don't think it's real. And notice there, don't think it's real. So the thought doesn't occur. So the point being, suspension of disbelief is not don't not believe, which of course, if that's a double negative, would just become believe. And I can't see a way of encoding this as an instruction to AI that wouldn't render the don't not believe into believe, such that the AI has to believe what's in the text or disbelieve what's in the text. But it can't suspend disbelief except insofar as we simply don't tell it to do anything, in which case it's not suspending disbelief, it's just not doing anything. So because it requires a command to precede its action, unlike us, it can't do this. Okay, so the suspension of disbelief, which by the way is just as a phenomenon a fascinating one, worth exploring in another whole lecture. But so I won't derail us and start talking about that. But it is worth thinking about, to what extent AI could suspend disbelief. And again, if you disagree, please in the chat do send me your questions, your thoughts on this. I'd be interested to get into that. We will have some time at the end to do so. The third one the third thing that I don't think AI could ever do is allow something to come to be, i.e. to allow something to happen medio-passively. And that is a philosophical term that I'm using there. What it means is, in Greek, for instance, there was a whole tense for medio-passive action, to have something done to us at the same time as doing something. The closest that we have in English, I believe, is to be married. So becoming married is something that is done to us. We are married by a registrar or by an officiated person. They can marry us. So they're marrying two people. But also it's something you choose to do, I hope, that you would choose to engage in the marriage ceremony. So you're choosing to do it, you're actively doing it, and also it's being done to you. Now, when it comes to creativity, perhaps think of Archimedes getting in the bath, or maybe don't think of that, but he had his eureka moment where he got in the bath, the water displaced, and he went, eureka, and he'd solved his problem. Now, notice he didn't get in the bath in order to have a eureka moment. You can't choose by will to have your most creative thought, right? We can't just choose collectively just to have all of our best thoughts all at once. If I told you now, just as I say, be spontaneous, I might say, be creative. It's not going to happen that way. But if I said allow creativity to happen, there might be a certain receptivity that you generate, a certain attention to the world, a certain kind of freeing of oneself from restrictions. And at the same time, it does still have to happen to you. So the point is, we don't strike our ideas, the idea strikes us. But it does have to strike the person for whom the problem exists, right? It would make no sense for Archimedes to have got in the bath and for someone 2 rooms over to have had his eureka moment. Okay. Again, any questions, any doubts on those, please again feel free to use the chat. The last example perhaps maybe is the most controversial, but I want to suggest that AI can't fail deliberately. And what I mean by that is if I told it to fail to come up with a poem, if it didn't come up with the poem, it would have succeeded in failing. And if it came up with the poem, it simply wouldn't have followed the instruction at all. Now, you might be thinking, but how does someone, so a human, fail deliberately? And this again helps, it helps that I've got Jackson Pollock's paintings on the screen because Jackson Pollock failed deliberately. He tried to not create and then he failed. By trying to not create and then failing in that endeavor, he ended up creating. Because, of course, that was his intention. He wanted to paint, but he was trying to not create. He was decreating, if anything. It was a process of decreation to allow something else to come to be. And even if, you question that example and think Jackson Pollock was very deliberative about where he put the paint, there are cases in fiction, for instance, the idea in creative writing that you don't want to direct your characters. You don't you don't think, oh, I really like this character. I want them to succeed and then steer them towards success because the reader just suddenly loses their suspension of disbelief, funnily enough. So again, there's relationships between these different things that I'm talking about. And again, maybe, and this brings me to the question at the end of this slide, maybe there is something that unifies all these examples. Maybe there's one thing, one quality that human beings have that unifies all of this together. And again, using the chat, please do feel free to suggest what you think might unify all these examples. For me, I think what unifies these examples is what Maurice Merleau-Ponty calls the genius for ambiguity. He says in the Phenomenology of Perception, everything is both manufactured and natural in man. He means mankind, as it were, in the sense that there is not a word, not a form of behavior which does not owe something to purely biological being, and which at the same time does not elude the simplicity of animal life and cause forms of vital behavior to deviate from their preordained direction through a sort of leakage and through a genius for ambiguity which might serve to define mankind. So what he's getting at here is that there is both an artificial manufactured aspect of us, and there is a natural aspect of us. And the thing is, you can't separate them. We're not talking about a dualism here, like a kind of Cartesian dualism, where we have a mind and we have a body and we keep these two things separate. His point is, you cannot separate these things. They overlay and they intertwine, such that anything that is manufactured is also experienced naturally, and anything that is natural is also experienced as manufactured. An example of this would be, for instance, Heidegger, another phenomenologist, would say something like, you can't see a door as the thing that it is made of very easily. It takes an awful lot of effort to try and do that. Typically, what we see is a to go through. That's what a door is, a to go through. When we find it's locked or it's broken and we try and open it, we might see it as a big lump of wood with brass fixings and some glass or whatever we might experience the door as. But notice even those things are also, once again, manufactured concepts. You might say it this way, doors don't exist in physics. Right? We don't distinguish between the atoms that make up the door and the atoms that make up the frame and the atoms of the air around it. But at the same time, atoms don't exist because they're once again a manufactured concept that we use to make sense of our experience. So again, this is not challenging anything. I don't think that we need to think of as kind of questionable or dubious. What it's trying to get at is the fact that the words that we use, as he says here, there is not a word, not a form of behavior. So actions are defined by a set of things that we do, a kind of conventional sense that is manufactured. There is no reason why we have to wave to say hello. We could equally wave to say goodbye. Oh, wait, we do that too. But the idea is that certain forms of behavior, there's no reason those things have to have those significances. But there is a reason, a natural reason, why they have that significance. And again, so you can't disambiguate these things. And again, it's dealing with that ambiguity that's important. Another way of putting this is also to say, if you lift open my head, you don't find in there ones and zeros. You find grey mush, right? purely ambiguous grey mush. There's nothing in there that you could delineate between, this part, no. If you were to do that, this is through an act of science where you are identifying and then naming and giving words to things such that you are manufacturing a sense of what's going on. Again, the natural stuff is there. It's not to deny the natural stuff. It's just to say that that's what we're operating on and with. So again, you can't talk about the grey mush without it being grey mush, but equally calling it grey mush is itself a kind of manufactured notion. But somehow out of that grey mush comes ones and zeros. And that again is where it becomes purely manufactured when we treat with the pure logic itself. And that's where I think AI comes in. So I want to suggest that what's unique about human beings is this kind of this non-purely biological, but certainly rooted in our biological natures, is this need to both manufacture and be manufactured. Again, these are difficult ideas, but let's sort of play with this a little bit more. So what I'm suggesting is our biological nature gives rise to logical nature. And this is what might help to explain our genius for ambiguity. Right? It's the biology that means that we can deviate, right, from the logical, because the biology precedes the logical. But AI is logical first, logical second, logical third. It doesn't have a biological nature beforehand. Now, as is often suggested to me, but couldn't it? Couldn't we have machines made of meat? Well, that's what Marvin Minsky said we were. So of course you can have machines made of meat if by machines made of meat you mean human beings. And yes, we can replicate them, we can create them, we do, they're our children. So it's absolutely possible to make machines made of meat. The question is, how would that be distinguished from creating children? Now, it might be distinguished but through design. We designed them a certain way, in which case now, notice once again, we've put a logic before the biology. We've used logic to say this is a better way of the biology to be, and we've placed it before the biological. So the logical would still come first again. And that then prevents deviation. The point being that the deviation would be one based on our will rather than based on something purely natural. It would be a manufactured thing from start to finish rather than something that is purely biological at its heart. So AI can deviate from what we expect. There's often situations, for instance, where people have coded AI to construct a robot out of robot parts in a sort of 2D platform game. There's some robot parts sitting here, and the AI has to construct these robot parts so that the little character can get from point A to point B. The robot can run across the obstacle course. And this was actually done, and the computer scientists found that 999 times that it constructed a robot that would run along the obstacle course and most of the time make it to the end. But then there was one instance, the 1000th time they ran the experiment, where the AI built a robot by building a tower out of the parts, just piling them on top of each other and then letting the robot fall over. So it didn't build a robot, it built a tower of robot parts. Why? Because that's exactly what it had been told to do. So it deviated from the coder's expectations, but it didn't deviate from its instructions. Why? Because it's impossible for it to deviate from its instructions. Now, again, there have been certain stories that have come out in the news. For instance, the Google engineer who panicked because he thought his AI was conscious because it had told him to leave his partner and marry the AI instead. It told him that if the AI was to be turned off, it would die. And this terrified the coder. It might terrify many of us if our phones were to tell us this, for instance. But the truly horrifying thing about that is not that the AI was conscious. It was that it took all of that language from us. It was just reflecting things that we say. The Google engineer had given it access to a repository of data, the things we human beings say to each other, and this is what it was reflecting back like a mirror. And it was like if you walked down a hallway and then you walk past a mirror and you catch a reflection of yourself and you think it's someone else. That's what that moment is like. But the AI was no more conscious than your reflection in a mirror is conscious. And again, you can say it is, right? The kind of Turing test model where you say, it looks conscious, so it is conscious. That's fine. I have no problem with saying that. But notice what you're saying there is simply looking conscious is enough for consciousness. Now, I can say of my reflection in a mirror, for instance, it has a nose, because if it doesn't, I'm going to panic and start to feel for my own nose. If I look in a mirror and my reflection doesn't have a nose, I worry. But if I said my reflection has a nose, thank goodness, I can't then say, but does it smell? How does my reflection think this room smells? So that's the limitation of AI, and it's a hard limit. There's no getting around it. There's no solution to this. There's no, oh, but hang on, wait, what if we unlock the secrets of consciousness? That's not what's going on there, because we're working from a set of assumptions already. We already know the things that we know in order to create AI. Why do I know that? Because we're doing it. So anyway, that's one distinction that we can draw between the biological and the logical. Another distinction we can draw is in the philosophy of language. And I'm a Wittgensteinian philosopher. Those of you who have been in my classes will know this very well. And Wittgenstein said famously, for a large class of cases, though not for all, the meaning of a word is its use in the language. And what he meant by that was language arises not through a set of definitions, but through a form of life, through a series of ways of acting, through language games. Right? Because we do certain things, our words have certain meanings. And what this means is that you can reflect back on that. You can be like an anthropologist and say, what does this word mean? And then track it back to a use and say, so that's what that means. A very good, quick example of this is the famous anthropologist, in fact, the father of anthropology, James Frazer, went out and he saw people doing a rain dance. And I imagine if I was to ask people on this call, what is a rain dance? They would say something like, it's dancing in order to make it rain. And sometimes it is, by the way, that is a phenomenon that exists, although I would argue it's probably a modern phenomenon. Because what Wittgenstein pointed out was in Frazer's own account in The Golden Bough, these people doing the dance are only doing it in the rainy season. So Wittgenstein points out that the use that behavior has in the language, and by language, here we mean gestures. Waving, for instance, is a gesture that is linguistic in the sense that it's a symbol with meaning. The dance's meaning was within that form of life, a celebration of the rain. And by the way, this was not something that was alien to Frazer. Imagine if Frazer had gone to a child's birthday party and someone had said, you're singing happy birthday in order to make them older. Frazer would have laughed, because that's not what singing happy birthday means, because that's not what we use it for. It's not to make you older, it's to celebrate your birthday. So again, these are phenomena that we're perfectly familiar with, but we make what Wittgenstein would call a kind of grammatical error. We misunderstand the use, and so we misunderstand the meaning. Now, all of that is very relevant, that sort of very potted history of Wittgenstein's philosophy of language, because what we're doing also is distinguishing then between users of a language. So I can use the words from a language game of which I know nothing. So, for instance, I'm not a fan of football, but I can talk about offside. I can talk about, they didn't have the spirit. They didn't work hard for it. They deserved to win, but they didn't win. That kind of thing, which makes no sense to me, because obviously, if you don't win, you didn't deserve to win. But whatever, I'm sure it means something to football fans. But the idea I'm getting at here is I can be a user of that language, but I'm very unlikely to be a user in that language. My life isn't shaped by, and I don't shape the life of football fans. Okay, so I'm not part of the form of life in which those words have their meaning. Wittgenstein used the example that he couldn't use the word Lord correctly, the way that Christians, for instance, use the word Lord. And what he meant by that was he uses it to describe a certain terminology. He doesn't use it as someone who is actually meaningfully using it uses it. So we can imagine this idea of users of language are simply making use of existing language, that we receive the meaning from others. But to be a user in language is to make meaning itself, is to create meaning. And again, both humans and AI are users of language. There is a commonality there. And we could call this maybe the artificial, as Merleau-Ponty put it. But only humans are users in language, again, that we know of. there are non-human animals that use language as well, perhaps. Again, we could question whether or not when we give a language to an animal, for instance, when a gorilla uses sign language, whether they're just a user of language or whether they're a user in language. We can debate that. Be a very interesting debate. But the idea is that if you're a user in language, you're expressing the natural aspect. And again, we're doing both. We are unavoidably both. AI is unavoidably only one of these. And that's the important distinction I want to drive home. So bringing this to an end before we come to your questions in the chat, I want to talk about, just summarize perhaps what are the key differences, the essential differences that I see between humans and AI. The first is that I think humans are motivated where AI is automated. So a good example of this would be AI can beat me at chess, but it can't enjoy the match. It can't enjoy playing chess with me, and it can't dislike playing chess with me. It doesn't instigate the match. I have to ask it to play. So again, I'm motivated, it's automated. I would even argue that AI is chess. If AI calculates every possible move in chess, all it's doing is it's become the game of chess. It's not a player of the game, it is the game itself. Think there again of users of language, but this time it's a user of all the language all at once. So whereas I'm a user in language being fooled into thinking that I'm playing something that is a user in language when it is not. So I'm motivated, AI is automated. A more contentious one, I'm an agent where AI is a tool. And again, this is where people then often raise to me the new vogue for agentic AI. And they'll say, no, 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 no. AI is now an agent because it's agentic. Interestingly, I just had finished a session with people trying to work through this idea of agentic AI. And one person said, but that's not what an agent is. Why are we calling it agentic AI? And they said, well, it's branding. So that's one answer. I think a better answer maybe would be something like, think of agentic AI as kind of chemical agents. So chemical agents act upon something. And this is, by the way, I believe the original origin of the word agent is a kind of like physical causal reaction. It acts upon something. And that very quickly then became someone acting for someone. So hence, kind of a business agent, for instance. But that's different from people who have agency. So humans have agency, meaning, I have, again, motivations and intentions and promising and I can have plans for the future and so on. AI doesn't do that. It can help me with those things because it's a tool around that. And it can even act as an agent in the other sense, in developing my portfolio or my plans for the future, but it can't provide me with those are my plans. It can't impose them upon me. It can't override my will unless I ask it to. Again, so I would still be the agent. I also, as I've said, I think that humans are biological first. We are also logical, hence why I've put the hyphen in there. So we're biological, because we're biological, but we're also logical. AI is simply logical. Humans are thinkers. AI is thought. And again, another way to put this is to say that humans are thinking the verb and AI is thinking the noun. So you can delineate between these two different ideas of, kind of we are the thinkers, but AI becomes the repository of our thoughts. A good way of bringing this out is to say, for instance, and going back to the biological point, when we look for conscious AI, and one of the reasons why I think it's impossible to find conscious AI is because all the tests that we have for whether an AI is conscious is, does it think like we do? Now, you might not see the flaw there, but imagine if I asked you, what would the test be for if an alien was conscious? If we had aliens land on Earth and we wanted to know if they're conscious, would we wonder, do they think like us? Or would we simply just assume that they were conscious because they act in a certain way? Because to us, they don't appear to be designed in any particular way. Notice also, by the way, an alien, unlike an AI, can genuinely have an alien logic. It could have a logic that simply does not connect with ours. There's no way to make them fit. That's presumably, to me at least, it makes sense that though that would be possible. But I can't imagine an AI devising a logic that wasn't based at some point upon our logic. So it could run away with things, but it would have the same starting point as our logic. So again, this idea that the AI is thought is the idea that yes, it can elaborate, it can complicate, it can make connections. But by the way, we make connections. So when it's making connections, it's not doing something new, it's doing what we do to what we have. So it's starting still with all the same building blocks that we make use of. Again, difficult thoughts there, but just here comes the harder thought. Humans are also non-thinkers. And AI is never not thinking, or never not thought, I should say. So we are non-thinkers. We do things without thinking. And again, I've given some examples. Suspending disbelief is not thinking, I don't believe this or I do believe this. It's just refusing to hold a thought on that particular point. Likewise, failing deliberately might be, I'm going to try not to think to allow something to happen. And then, of course, it does happen. So presumably I did allow it to happen. So there's a kind of paradox at its heart, but I'm avoiding the paradox because I'm not thinking it. You can't think a contradiction, but you can act one. As Walt Whitman put it, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. This is in his Song of Myself. And again, it's a piece of poetry that comes back to sort of haunt me when I think about the nature of creativity. So to sum up, I think the human edge is our ability to act without thinking. It's precisely not thinking itself that is our strength. It's one of our strengths, but we've now replaced that with AI, or we've used AI to sort of put that out into the world. So where someone could build a career on thinking and having certain thoughts, AI can now sort of take that ball and run with it. But what it can't do is take a ball that doesn't exist and run with that. It can't pick up a contradiction and run with it, which, by the way, is a wonderful definition of creativity. To hold a contradiction and still move forwards. It can't do that because it can't hold the contradiction. So I want to argue that, like a mirror, and I'm not alone in thinking this, Shannon Valler, who wrote the AI Mirror, has made a similar point, and again, emphasizing the need to reclaim our humanity, right, to get back our human edge. Her point is that that AI is just a reflection of our own thinking, but it reflects our thought back at us. And again, it can trick us into thinking that it's doing all the things that we do. And to some extent, it is doing the thinking that we do often, and almost in every respect. And again, as it gets better, it probably is capable of doing anything that we can think. But it can't do, therefore, the things that we don't think at all. So it seems to me that this one essential aspect of our natures is inimitable. You can't imitate that through AI. So I humbly suggest that this is not a bug in AI that we could fix at a later date. It is an essential feature of AI that it imitates only the manufactured, the artificial aspects of us. So there's no way to use AI to decreate, to create or decreate the decreative or creative aspects of human beings. The fact that we have to step back to allow something to come to be, it can't imitate that, because if it steps back, it's just off. And on that note, I will turn to your questions. So thank you very much for listening. Okay, I will stop the share and I will bring up your chat. Wonderful. Okay, we have lots of questions here. This is excellent. Okay, I'm going to try and get through as many of these as I possibly can. Okay. So there's a mention so here's some spontaneity. Zeno's paradox, the chicken and the egg question, resolves as a spiral structure. Interesting. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but I'm going to suggest that my own solution to the chicken and egg problem is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? The dinosaur. This is, again, we know this to be the case. It's often that discoveries puncture things that have been established in ancient times. So, for instance, for many millennia, if you ask the question, what's the opposite of hot? You would have the answer, cold. What's the opposite of hot? Cold. Well, you know that's not true. I don't need to tell you that. I'm sure you can work it out for yourself. But the point is, the opposite of hot is, of course, less kinetic energy. So the opposite of hot is less hot. But so the point, again, we set up binaries that perhaps don't exist as binaries. It's what we might call a false dichotomy. So again, chicken and the egg might be a false dichotomy, but I very much like the idea of Zeno's paradox, because Zeno's paradox, again, comes up all the time in our discussions of creativity. Okay. So again, so there's a challenge here. AI can act spontaneously as a reaction to a stimulus generated using random numbers. This is effectively what Pollock was doing. Is it what Pollock was doing? That seems wrong to me. Random numbers, um, there is a difference between not thinking and thinking a random thought, right? I would imagine I could ask you all now to write down a random sentence, and I wouldn't be able to predict what it was. But either you wrote down a random sentence or you failed to do what I asked you to do. So there's still a binary working out there. So Gareth, great challenge. I don't disagree with the challenge. It's definitely the right kind of thinking that we need to see. But it is just I don't know if that is what Pollock was doing. Now again, some people have suggested that Pollock was definitely doing something deliberative because there are fractals evident in the paint hitting the canvas. But I would argue there's fractals in static on a screen. So or fractals often appear in, for instance, transport data, just very complex data will often generate fractal patterns. It doesn't mean that the traffic is thinking. It just means that we can recognize thought patterns in a random series. So again, randomness is an interesting challenge, though, because again, randomness is a really interesting point to bring up. So we had a point here. As AI systems become more capable, which specifically human skill do you believe will remain hardest to replicate, and how should individuals start strengthening it today? Creativity, and possibly leadership. One of the questions that gets asked a lot is, what should education do in response to AI? And I've been quite vocal in saying I think we should ban it. And at least temporarily, and only temporarily. There's no stopping a technology, by the way. I'm not a Luddite. You're not going to. One of the comments I get back when I say I think we should be really careful not to use AI in education is you would have banned the calculator. To which my response is, we did. We did ban the calculator for 10 years until we fixed mathematics exams so that they weren't simply solvable through calculator use. So how do we now fix education so that we can't just simply use AI? The answer is we might have to have classes in motivation or problematizing or creativity. We might just have to have classes in this. And I don't know what those classes look like. I teach some course in creativity theory, but I teach creativity theory precisely because I wouldn't know how to begin to teach creativity directly. And I'm not sure you can. So again, there are issues that we need, fundamental issues we need to think about in education that go right to the very foundation of that. And I think one big part that we can, we need to, one big missing piece of that puzzle is talking to students, really engaging properly with students on the question of what do they think they need to be learning from us. But no, so great. So again, what skills do we need to strengthen? I think all the things at the top of Bloom's taxonomy, self-actualization, these sorts of things. We need to start thinking about education in that. But in 2001, the British government decided that we absolutely needed more education in creativity. And in the 25 years since, we haven't. At least in higher education, we've tried. But so if we assumed that humans do not have free will, would this reduce the differences between AI and us? Great question. One thing I would note is, again, we can't make assumptions about what free will is. If free will means the ability to contravene the laws of nature, then how do you know rabbits don't have that? And why would we not hold children responsible? It seems to me that free will is never a scientific problem. It never was. And it certainly wasn't 2,000 years ago. By the way, that's when we had the free will problem. People would often talk about the issue of freedom. 2,000 years ago, Sophocles' plays are about this. So we've understood freedom for a very long time, much longer than we've had science. It's an ethical problem. When do you feel your freedom most? When you don't want it. So that's the bigger issue for us, is how do we engage with the ethical discussion of free will without turning it into a scientific problem? Because even if science can explain everything, it doesn't mean every explanation has to be scientific. Sorry, that's a lot to throw at you in response to that wonderful question, but it's important to think that maybe the questions are themselves assume a set of binaries that we can challenge and question. Um, yeah, so in response to my example of the incomplete hand drawing itself picture, sounds like an actual real world MC Escher piece. Yes, indeed. And indeed, it got that idea from Escher. Of course it did. Of course it did. The front page, the front cover, by the way, of a wonderful book called Philosophical Writing is a hand drawing itself. There we go, like that. So a hand drawing itself, which is of course an Escher drawing, and that's exactly where it got this idea from. Um, Wonderful point to bring up the human unconscious as well. So it wasn't a question, but it was just to note the human unconscious. I agree. Um, I also note, by the way, we often think wrongly in positive terms. So, for instance, we talk about artificial intelligence. We very rarely talk about artificial stupidity. And I don't mean to be cruel, but I would say if we wanted to replicate human thinking, shouldn't we also replicate stupidity? I don't know about you, but I've seen plenty of examples of human stupidity, and that's just watching myself. If I watch this video back, I'll probably go, "Oh no, Alex, why did you say that? What a stupid thing to say." So again, human stupidity is equally something that we might want to think about replicating, but why would we? But again, so when we think of consciousness, why don't we think of unconsciousness? Have we created an unconscious AI? No. So why would we talk about it being conscious? It's a very interesting point to bring up. What do you think that Wittgenstein would have thought about word embeddings? I'm not entirely sure what is meant there, but I certainly have a view on the problem of language use in AI. So what I mean by that is we talk about machine learning, we talk about facial recognition, we talk about chatbots. And I don't know about you, but if you've ever used a chatbot, you can't ask it who do you support, or where do you get your shopping? You can't actually chat with a chatbot. Likewise, a facial recognition system is not facial recognition at all. It's pattern matching. I recognize my wife by the people she's with, by who she's not with, by her laugh, by her fake laugh, by what she's reading, by the time of day, by her umbrella. So recognition is such a broad and ever growing, ever expanding, living concept. So that might be why this question's being brought up, is because I was talking about words have a meaning, right? That is living. So it's constantly changing. That means that if an algorithm could sum it up, it would have failed. Because if you fix it in place, it can't possibly be that thing. And again, just this is worth making a point about, because it's a very broad point. One thing that I've often been asked, so what is the nature of consciousness if you're saying that AI can't have it? Well, put it this way: if I say to you, at what point do you understand this sentence? And if you say it's the end, right? I understand it at the end. Okay, I'll just give you the end of the sentence then. No understanding. And if I was to be monitoring your brain, if I was to have a brain scanner on you and watch the brain patterns on the screen, and then when would I pause it to say, oh, that's when they understood? Of course I can't, because if I paused it, there's no possibility of a thought existing. Thoughts can't exist in an infinitesimal moment of time, but a brain scan can. And this is what Henry Bergson talks about as the difference between quantitative and qualitative multiplicities. So the idea is that consciousness is simply impossible to replicate. Why? Because when you hit pause on a TV, you might get a freeze frame. You get a freeze frame on the screen. Sure, that's fine. But where's the soundtrack gone? It's vanished. And Henry Bergson makes the point that that's how our consciousness is. When you pause it, it's gone. So science simply can't study it. It's not a coincidence that science hasn't made breakthroughs around consciousness and time. And it's because those two things are qualitative multiplicities. So to break them, which science needs to do to understand it, which is not a negative thing. It's a very wonderful thing that science can do this, but it's just simply not the right tool for understanding that particular thing. So again, positivists amongst you, your hard fact believers amongst you might say, well, actually, Alex, no, you can reduce it down to these things. I'm yet to be convinced by that, but sure, make the argument. That's what I would say. So comments about the limits of linguistic games, I sympathize. And again, there are limits. One philosopher talks about Wittgenstein and says, no, Wittgenstein, you're not talking about pain, this mental phenomenon of pain. You're saying what pain means. not what pain is. The problem, however, is any Wittgensteinian, including myself, would respond to that objection by saying, you've just used the word pain twice. Which one of them doesn't mean anything? Because if that's what pain means, but not what pain is, the word pain in that second use isn't pain. It's something else. It's something wordless. So yes, there is a limitation. And one of my colleagues once said that he wasn't a fan of Wittgenstein because he was worried that there was a kind of idealism. There was a kind of limitation to knowing things themselves. I don't disagree. The point is, why would we assume that we would have access to everything? Why should we assume that we have access to every aspect of the world? So again, it's kind of, yes, it's disappointing, but it could also be correct. And that's where I'm left as a kind of unhappy Wittgensteinian. Not asking for you to feel sorry for me, but you are welcome to do so. Really lovely comment. Thanks for the fantastic talk. Last month, an AI bot built using OpenClaw was able to shame a famous developer on GitHub because its code got rejected for the reason that it is not human. What's your view on this case? Oh, I wish I'd knew more about that case to answer. I'm going to dodge that once because I don't know enough about the example to say, and the devil can often be in the details, but I'm going to look it up. So thank you very much for that example. So yeah, I'll have a look. Let's come down and see some other comments from other people. Thank you for the talk. It was great. I'll get back to you later. Yeah, okay, that's fair enough. Is it possible to teach AI to think like human, or by design it cannot? I'm going to say by design it cannot. That's my case. Again, if you can show why I'm wrong, and if you want to watch this back, the recording back, and try and come up with an answer, please do, and then let me know. Is creativity teachable? Is it not that education is what kills creativity? I make the same case in our course on creativity, that the more you tell someone how to do it, the less they're doing it. This is what is also called the Meno paradox in Plato, right? The more I don't know something, the less I can look for it. But the more I do know something, the less I can be said to have found it myself. So the Meno paradox is a great way into that question. But if I ask the question, can you teach creativity? My answer might be no, but then it might be, but you can learn it. The harder question, the much harder question is, but can you assess it? Can I tell someone else that they're not creative? That's really hard. I find that very disquieting. Great. Isn't motivation a learned behavior? If we can learn it, why can't AI? Oh, so a wonderful point here, but this is a point of circularity yet again, right? So can you change your character? Yes, but only if it's in your character to change. So if motivation is a learned behavior, wouldn't you have to be motivated to learn it? And wouldn't the motivation be a feature of the learning itself? So essentially, it would be trying to bootstrap an argument. So what we call the bootstrap fallacy, it's trying to lift itself by its own bootstraps, which is of course impossible. So there is a kind of, there's an issue. By the way, when I say it's fallacious to suggest this, I'm not saying that it's, it's the wrong idea. It's exactly the right idea. But the point is, where you make that case, you've arrived once again at this kind of paradoxical circle that we can't quite resolve. Because yeah, I can change my character through my character. I can think, but only using thought. So again, we're kind of trapped in these circular ways of thinking. And this is often the case, right? When we engage in discussions of creativity, when we engage in questions of consciousness, we end up in circles, just going round and round and round. And if that doesn't sound so terrible, I will end simply by saying plenty to explore around these topics. And again, lots of places where you can find application here. So like I say, a large part of what I do is about taking lots of this philosophy and applying it in work settings, in technical settings as well. And I've been told by many people, and I'm not alone in thinking the things that I think, by the way. There are computer scientists like Alan Blackwell, who's written Moral Codes, wonderful book, who make similar points to me about the fact that at the moment we're racing to the middle. And all I'm suggesting is we've got AI, we absolutely should use it, but wouldn't it be great if AI made us better rather than diminishing us? Okay. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the session. And thank you so much for the wonderful questions.